Welcome to Water Nerds, where, you guessed it, nerds talk about water. I'm Dr. Eric Roy, HydroReef's founder and chief scientist.
And I'm Annalise Dijak, HydroReef's head of policy.
Well, cool. So we have a very timely Instagram Live for everyone today. And I think that everyone on Monday morning woke up to this really awful news about the current state of climate change. And so you had recently written this article about droughts. And so this IPCC report highlighted, what our new normal is going to kind of look like with these increased weather events and extreme drought conditions and all of the other things that are kind of surrounding climate change, and especially how it's going to impact people in the U.S. Droughts were something that the IPCC really highlighted in this report. And so it's something that we've been talking a lot about at HydroReef because there are so many other ways that droughts can impact our lives other than just not having water available. That's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm really excited to dig into this. So like I just said, when people think of droughts, they're automatically kind of thinking of, all right, we're just going to have less water available. And so that's just kind of, not the case. It's way more than that. And so you kind of highlighted it in your article, 3 of these major secondary consequences of drought that are often kind of going overlooked. I'm excited to dig into this. And I think it's also important to point out that this won't just impact people in the West, but people across the entire country and ultimately the entire world. So Emily, what are these kind of 3 damages or secondary consequences that you highlighted in your article?
Yeah, so I definitely wanted to highlight, we don't always see these consequences right away, just because most of the time when a drought occurs, we're so focused on the immediate, there's no water, surface water levels decrease, but a lot of these secondary impacts impact groundwater. And so the things that I highlighted were seawater intrusion, which happens a lot in coastal areas, land subsidence, which is also known as land sinking, when land sinks when just things sink. And then both of these and other factors contribute to drinking water infrastructure damage. Parts of the infrastructure can be damaged because of land subsidence and seawater intrusion, and just also other things that occur when drought conditions are prolonged, such as they are in the West right now.
Okay, yeah. So those are certainly 3 things that I don't really think about when I think of droughts. So I think it would be helpful to kind of take us through what each of these things mean and really how they can impact people's day-to-day lives in the U.S. So we can start with seawater intrusion or saltwater intrusion. I think those are interchangeable terms, but yeah. So what do we need to know about seawater intrusion?
Yeah, so with seawater intrusion, it happens in coastal areas. So when you have groundwater and you have ocean water or salt water, when those two meet, there's this area called a zone of transition that happens right in coastal areas. And that zone of transition is what prevents, saltwater and salinated water from infiltrating that groundwater and making the groundwater, undrinkable and incredibly salty. But in a drought, when that groundwater level is depleted and it's not being replenished, those groundwater aquifers aren't being recharged, then there isn't enough groundwater to prevent that seawater from coming up into those groundwater aquifers. So that zone of transition keeps getting higher and higher and higher. And, groundwater wells, you can't adjust how deep they go. So those groundwater wells start pumping up salinated water that is not, you can't drink it. And it's not great for crops. It's just unusable at the, like,
so it kind of has to do with like the water table. So if the groundwater, the fresh water that we use for drinking is depleted, then that salt water can come in and kind of take over.
Yeah, it rises, it gets into those aquifers, and just the level keeps getting higher and higher and higher. And that's when we run into saltwater intrusion. And so, but again, that happens mostly in coastal areas. So you see it a lot in, California, especially right now with this prolonged drought. And then, continued pumping of that groundwater when it's not being recharged also contributes to this. California actually just mandated that groundwater pumps have to have water meters installed now so that they can measure how much groundwater people and, farmers, agricultural, they're pumping out so that they can have better groundwater management practices. Okay.
Yeah. And it's interesting because in places like California where the surface water is so limited, they're turning to groundwater. But now with this seawater intrusion coming into play, like that kind of is like, all right, what's the next source? Like where, it's like a secondary impact that creates water scarcity, essentially.
Yeah. We think that groundwater is just always going to be there, but during a drought, it isn't being replenished because of lack of precipitation, lack of rainfall. Those groundwater aquifers just aren't being recharged, and that's when you get groundwater shortages, and it leads to these secondary consequences.
Okay. Jeez.
Yeah. Very bright and
right.
cheery outlook.
I know that was that IPCC report. Everyone was like, "Okay, happy Monday." So then the second one that you highlighted, which also is one of those phenomenons that I don't think people really believe is going to happen in their area, or it's kind of one of those things where it's like, oh, landslides or whatever it is. That doesn't really happen here. So take us into land subsidence, however that can affect people's day-to-day lives, and really how it has to do with groundwater and this whole idea of depleting resources.
Yeah, so we talked about, lack of rainfall contributes to lack of groundwater. Those groundwater aquifers aren't being recharged. So all that water takes up volume underneath the surface. And when that volume is being depleted and isn't being replenished, that's when soil starts to compact. And that leads to, just the ground sinking, because there's just not that volume underneath the surface to hold it up anymore. So that's when you get that sinking of the land. And it's happened a lot. It isn't really something that, like you said, we don't really think about it all that much, but it definitely has an effect. And it's especially being seen in the West with this prolonged drought.
Okay, got it. All right. And so what you just mentioned kind of also contributes to infrastructure damages, which is something that we certainly don't think about with droughts. It's not like an immediate correlation. But yeah, take us into that, because when I was reading this article that you wrote, I was so surprised that this was kind of included in this. So take us through how these droughts can impact infrastructure.
Yeah, so those two phenomena I just mentioned, seawater intrusion and land sinking, those can contribute to infrastructure damage. Like, for example, when land sinks, there are pipes running underneath the ground and everything and whatever, and those pipes can break. Contamination from seawater, it can render some groundwater aquifers unusable, and then you have to switch over to a different source, and that you have to switch over infrastructure, you have to build new infrastructure, replace old infrastructure. And I think it also just highlights the need, for better water infrastructure in the United States, because if you're having, especially now with climate change affecting our daily lives, we're going to be facing this. And so if we don't have the infrastructure to deal with it, then we're just going to have to keep replacing all of this damaged infrastructure, and the cost can add up.
Yeah. And it can render supplies unusable. Like if you're in a certain area where distribution pipes are, completely out of commission, I don't think that people in the US kind of understand what it's like to not have, running water. So you mentioned infrastructure, and obviously the infrastructure bill passed in the Senate a couple days ago. So it's headed to the House, and that's something that we'll definitely be talking about either next week or the week after on Instagram Live. I know we've done a previous live on infrastructure, but as you said, it's super important, and it really contributes to a lot of different issues with water, droughts, and just, boil water advisories are another thing that we've been seeing a lot of, and that also has to do with infrastructure. So, lots of great things. Okay, well, great. Any last thoughts or anything else you wanted to add?
I mean, just, when we're facing these drought conditions, it's just so important to conserve water whenever possible. Reusing water is super important. If you're living in an area that is facing drought conditions right now, repurposing water is super important, so that we can have as much clean drinking water as possible.
Yeah, totally agree. And so if you are living in those really drought-prone areas in the southwestern parts of the United States, these are things that you definitely want to be thinking about, and, perhaps raising to your local government. If this is something that people are proposing solutions to, or even just really talking about, I think that's definitely an action step that everyone can take. So
for sure, yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much, Emily. This is awesome. I think people learned a bunch, and we'll have your blog linked in our bio, so people will be able to read it and kind of look at some of the sources that you pulled for this live. So I hope that everyone takes this seriously and understands that droughts have way more consequences than just water availability. So thanks again. Thanks for watching, everyone. Happy Wednesday, and we'll see you next week. Bye.